You're listening to an Airwave Media podcast.
Hello all, Eric Rivenes with the Most Notorious podcast here. Each week I interview an author or historian about a historical true crime, tragedy, or disaster. Subject matter ranges from gunslingers to Gilded Age murder to gangsters to fires to pirates to wild prison breaks. My guests bring their incredible knowledge directly to you. Please subscribe to Most Notorious on your favorite podcast app. Cheers, and have a safe tomorrow.
Are you earning and investing in the stock market? In real estate? How about in relationships? Are you earning and investing in your life? I'm Doc G, semi-retired hospice physician and host of the Earn and Invest podcast, where we have the 201 or next level conversations about money and life. Not only how you make money and grow it, but also how you use your wealth to create a better and more fulfilling existence. Join us every Monday and Thursday wherever you listen to fine podcasts.
Hello everyone and welcome to History of the Second World War, episode 206, The Fall of France, Defeat. This week, a big thank you goes out to Kyle and Aurelia for choosing to support the podcast by becoming members. You can find out more about becoming a member over at historyofthesecondworldwar.com/members. On June 16th, the French Prime Minister, Reynaud, had resigned to be replaced by Marshal Pétain, who immediately moved into armistice negotiations with the Germans. The armistice was then signed on June 22nd and came into effect just 35 minutes after midnight on June 25th. But by that point, the signing of the armistice was mostly a formality. On June 17th, Pétain had announced to the French people that he was seeking that armistice and that we must stop the fighting. On June 18th, every French city and town of more than 20,000 people had been declared an open city and would be handed over to the Germans without a fight. And then when the armistice came into effect, the fighting in France was just over, at least for another 4 years. And so the question for many Frenchmen became, why? How? Who? What sequence of decisions and mistakes had led to this defeat? Different groups and different individuals would have their own answers to these questions. Pétain and his new government would place the blame squarely on the final pre-war governments, with particular blame being placed on the socialists of the Popular Front. There would also be blame placed upon General Gamelin and the pre-war French military leadership. This blame would eventually result in the Riom trials of 1942, trials that will be covered in episode 31 of this series, here in just a week. But since we're at the end of the fighting in France, and this is a military history podcast, it feels like it's time to dig into the campaign as a whole to try and make our own determination of who is to blame for France's defeat. An appropriate place to start the investigation is probably at the lowest level, with the French soldiers. I think it's instructive to look at how the last few days of the campaign played out at the front, even if that front was rapidly changing due to the French retreat. On June 17th, Pétain had sent his radio broadcast that made it clear that France was going to surrender, and that fighting needed to stop. But at the front, there was a shocking amount of fighting still happening. The declaration itself came as a shock to the vast majority of the French soldiers, even those relatively high up in the chain of command didn't realize how close things were. Many knew that things were not going well, particularly those at the corps command level, for example, who knew far more about the overall situation than those further down the command tree. But even those corps commanders assumed that French resistance would continue for some time. The French were generally in retreat everywhere, everybody knew that, and many of the military formations were sort of abandoned by French high command. But they kept hoping, or kept believing, that the French soldiers would continue to fight. The sort of abandonment of the French units at the front is best shown by the fact that on June 18th, a pretty critical day, the French high command would not issue any actual orders to the various armies, divisions, and units that were still retreating from the Germans. And without any new guidance on what to do, most simply continued on with their last orders from June 17th, which meant a retreat further away from the German forces and towards the south. At levels below high command, most of the day and the days that followed would see officers trying to keep their units together as best as they could given the very difficult situation. In southern France, efforts were being made to evacuate both France's gold reserves and as many Allied troops as possible. This included many of the Polish forces that remained in France. Hundreds of tons of both French and Belgian gold would be evacuated during this time from French ports towards Africa, and 27,000 Polish soldiers would also be able to make their way to Britain to continue the fight against Germany. After June 18th, though, several of the French armies suffered similar fates. They would be outpaced by the German mobile forces, surrounded, and then forced to surrender. This would occur to the 2nd Army Group when Guderian reached the Swiss border, with the French armies that were trapped within sort of being slowly squeezed by various German units until they surrendered on the 22nd of June. Other divisions continued retreating south at various levels of disorganization and confusion. Before the armistice went into effect, there were some instances where particularly pilots would actually take matters into their own hands, with 19 non-commissioned officers and 115 pilot trainees finding their way across the Channel to Britain in these final days. Elsewhere, the fighting kind of slowed down as the inevitability of the armistice became clear. The Germans would actually slow their pursuit of French forces, outside of a few motorized elements that would continue to press on as quickly as possible, and French resistance did continue during this time, albeit at a smaller scale. Some of the Maginot Line units would not surrender until the end of June, proving that French morale was far from shattered even under the pressure of the French defeats over the previous month and a half. But what does all of this tell us? I would say that it speaks quite well of the majority of French soldiers and their officers at least a sort of small unit level. They had experienced very little but defeat and retreat for the better part of 5 weeks by the time that the armistice came into effect. And even in those last few days, there would be real fighting between the Germans and the French. While many units would sort of just disintegrate during the retreat, as units almost always do in any army, a shockingly high number of soldiers actually stayed together during the long weeks of June. And before that retreat began, the French army had proven during the attacks of Case Red that they were still able to put up a fight and to cause real harm to the German forces that they faced. I think all of this speaks quite highly of the French soldier, at least at the lowest possible level of service or command. On the complete opposite side of the spectrum, we have the commander of the French army, General Weygand. Weygand was not appointed to the position until May 17th, after the initial disasters had already occurred along France's eastern border. This makes it difficult to blame him for all of the French army's failures, but he made a few critical mistakes immediately after taking command that exacerbated the situation, particularly due to the critical 2 days that he would spend trying to determine what to do after taking command. One of the largest criticisms that can be leveled against the French army officers in 1940 is that time and time again, they would sort of lack the urgency that the situations that they were in demanded. During earlier wars, maybe even during the First World War, this urgency was rarely required due to the slower pace of operations. However, in 1940, they faced an enemy that used the tremendous tempo of armored operations to great success. On the Belgian plain in the early days of the campaign, along the Meuse at the various areas where the Germans crossed the river, and then after the Meuse when the German armored divisions were outpacing their infantry on the way to the coast, there were many opportunities where the French army could have taken advantage of the situation if they had acted quickly and decisively. But then they just didn't. Instead, there were some half measures, there were dreams of larger plans that were outdated by the time that they were actually put into practice, and there were just a lot of delays. This criticism can be leveled against Weygand as well, because after spending 2 days trying to determine the exact course of action, the plan that he developed of an attack from the north and the south of the German salient was already out of date, with the German forces changing the situation in ways that made the attack impossible. Once the attack was cancelled, there was little that could be done for the troops trapped in the north, but Weygand resisted the idea of moving fully towards an evacuation policy like the British had, which increased confusion within the trapped forces. After Dunkirk, the French army was left with a much reduced force that had to try and hold against the Germans that everybody knew sort of would be attacking soon. And for this purpose, Weygand chose to stake everything on the defense of the Somme and Aisne rivers. To do this, a new tactic was used based around fortified villages and strongpoints, which in theory would deny the Germans the ability to easily move through the countryside. For this new tactic, as always, inspiration was found on the battlefields of the First World War, as always. Because what Weygand was trying to do here was similar to what had been done to meet some of the German spring offensives of 1918, particularly by the French army in Champagne. There was just one small problem. It was almost inevitable that the troops would be surrounded, But that was almost part of the plan, with Weygand writing that, quote, above all things, should a unit find itself cut off from its neighbors, it is not to withdraw, but to fight on, holding up the enemy and endangering his advance. The utmost effort must be made to deepen the zone of defense, end quote. In theory, these cut-off units would then be relieved by fast and active counterattack forces that would push back the German advances. But by June 1940, the French army had already lost most of the units that would have been used for this purpose. Instead, when a French unit was cut off, they were often cut off for good, and all they could do is resist as long as possible to slow the Germans down. To quote one French prisoner of war from his writings while in a German prisoner of war camp, quote, when one doesn't have what you need to furnish the front, one says to the troops, it doesn't matter. Form a series of enclosed strongpoints to fight in all directions and hold to the death. If the enemy passes between the strongpoints, it's not important, so long as the strongpoints hold. Yes, but most of the time, a strong point that has been bypassed collapses. End quote. What made things worse was a lack of radios, which often made it difficult to even coordinate counterattacks when they were possible, or to bring fire support from artillery to allow the trapped units to hold out longer. The end result of all of this was that for more and more French troops, they were either killed or forced to surrender, at a time when the French were already scrambling to get enough men into the field. Giving out orders to hold at all costs, while it did have its merits in some situations, also put the French army in this situation in a position where it was ill-prepared for when a breakthrough would occur, and the entire goal of the German army was to achieve such a breakthrough. This meant that French units, even behind the front, would find themselves surrounded by German forces that had managed to push through the French lines entirely. All of these criticisms have to be balanced against the fact that there was probably not a winning formula for the French army by the time that Case Red began on June 5th. I could spend an entire episode criticizing Weygand's strategy during the first weeks of June, but I don't think I could find an alternative with a greater chance of success. An area where I think criticism is more easily and more validly directed at Weygand is around his attitude and belief in victory, or his complete lack of belief in victory. Weygand entered the French High Command on May 17th full of vim and vigor, believing that he brought with him the key to glorious triumph. When that was robbed from him after the cancellation of his initial attack, he seems to have lost the ability to see a path towards not even victory, but anything other than total defeat. That mindset then cascaded down and around him, impacting the actions of the French army and the French government. And so, in some ways, the actions on the Somme and the Aisne and the French defensive efforts of hold at all costs until you die kind of is a symptom of a high command that was out of ideas. There was no real plan for what to do after. Sometimes there weren't even orders for what to do after a few days of retreat. And in the French cabinet, Weygand became one of the most vocal advocates for surrender. While writing the orders that demanded that his men fight on no matter what, giving their lives for the defense of France, Weygand had already given up. This episode of History of the Second World War is sponsored by Acorns. Acorns makes it easy to start automatically saving and investing, so your money has a chance to grow for you, your kids, and your retirement. You don't need to be an expert. Acorns will recommend a diversified portfolio that fits you and your money goals. You don't need to be rich. Acorns lets you invest with the spare money you've got right now. You can start with $5 or even just your spare change. It is, after all, a new year, and Acorns is a New Year's resolution that's easy to keep. It only takes about 5 minutes to open an account and to start automatically saving and investing your money so that it has a chance to grow. And the best part is that after you sign up, it can all happen automatically. So head over to acorns.com/SWWpod or download the Acorns app to start saving and investing for your future today. Paid client endorsement. Compensation provides incentive to positively promote Acorns. Tier 1 compensation provided. Investing involves risk. Acorns Advisors LLC and SEC registered investment advisor. View important disclosures at acorns.com/SWWpod. When evaluating the effectiveness of the French army during the campaign, and Weygand and Gamelin, who Weygand replaced, and all of the army's leadership, some caution needs to be taken to separate what actually happened from what they were blamed for after the defeat. After the signing of the armistice, Weygand, Pétain, and the Vichy government, in general, would spend the next several years trying to place the blame for France's defeat in kind of a very specific light, or with a very specific narrative. Their challenge was to blame the French army leadership of the interwar period and the French governments of the 1930s, while also not sort of running into the problem that all of the Vichy leaders had participated in those governments and had been active leaders of the army during the interwar years. To thread this needle required many discussions of kind of active sabotage and gross incompetence, which do not have a lot of evidence behind them, as would become evident at Riom. Again, we'll talk about that next episode. But there are three areas that go a long way to explaining why France was defeated in the spring of 1940. The first, we've already discussed earlier in this episode, a lack of urgency among the military leadership, which resulted in sluggish and sometimes non-existent reactions to German attacks. This is a theme that we've been tracking basically since the beginning of this series. It's happened time and time again. The second challenge was a lack of proper equipment, which was most telling in the areas of anti-tank guns and in tanks themselves. For anti-tank guns, as would happen for many nations during the early years of the war, the French army simply did not have enough of them, which was only partially rectified by the adaptability of the French artillerymen, who quickly started using their 75mm artillery guns as sort of direct-fire anti-tank weapons. They did not have enough of the right kinds of tanks either, with critical design flaws in otherwise very capable tanks like the Char B1 bis, making it difficult to use on the battlefield. The third challenge was that there was not enough equipment in reserve when things went wrong, like when most of the best divisions of the French army got trapped by the Germans and were forced to abandon most of their equipment. This challenge is mostly just kind of a symptom of the challenges that France had during rearmament, with it being difficult to produce the volume of equipment required by the French army to be successful in a modern war. When the fighting started, they had not even fully equipped all the units that were at the front, let alone created any kind of stockpile, should they be required. The lack of additional equipment made the manpower shortages even more problematic because not only were the French heavily outnumbered by June, they were also missing important equipment and weapons. Never a good combination. Also, a special mention goes out to the British when trying to determine the causes of France's defeat. At least a portion of the blame belongs in London. In some respects, the British were even less prepared than the French to fight against the Germans in 1940. And they were also in a position to constantly hedge their bets against a French defeat, which made them far from an ideal ally. Even when Churchill replaced Chamberlain as Prime Minister and brought with him a very different view of Britain's role in defending against Germany, the British were far from being all in with the French. From our perspective today, we can see that this was an important part of the final defeat of Germany, due to the importance of Britain and the British Isles later in the war. But that does not mean that the decisions of the British leaders in 1940 that allowed for that future possibility did not directly contribute to France's surrender in June of 1940. They did play a part in that final decision. While the Germans would decisively defeat France, this victory would not come without a cost. The official numbers for casualties over the course of the entire campaign were about 156,000 for the Germans, of which 45,000 were killed or missing. Now, this is a drop in the bucket for the overall number of German casualties during the war, but was over 3 times the number of casualties that the German military suffered during the invasion of Poland 9 months before. One of the interesting things about that number, the 156,000, is the fact that the majority of the casualties, around 57%, came not during the opening assaults during May, but instead during Case Red in June. While by that point the French army was much diminished in terms of numbers and equipment, the Germans also no longer benefited from surprise, which was such a major factor during the early parts of the campaign. Along with the manpower that was lost, in the air the Luftwaffe lost about 1/4 of all of the aircraft that it committed to the campaign, which meant that around 1,200 total German aircraft would be destroyed. The losses would be the heaviest among the bombers, with a 30% attrition rate among medium and light bombers and a similar number among Stuka squadrons. These losses would become critical when the Luftwaffe was called upon to undertake its greatest task of the war so far, which was the air assault on Britain, at which point it really could have used some of those bombers that were lost over France, and the over 1,100 airmen that were lost in their aircraft as well. Now, these losses for the Luftwaffe were kind of balanced against Allied air losses, which were larger than the German figure, but the exact number here is a bit harder to determine, with the British losing somewhere around 1,000 aircraft themselves, and the French losing around 650 maybe, and then some small number lost by other Allied nations. But there are some pretty wild swings in the numbers I'm finding for sort of Allied aircraft lost. And it kind of depends on exactly how you count the numbers, I think, the time frame you include, and if you take the war as a whole or just operations over France and the Low Countries. What we do know is that both in terms of aircrew and aircraft, the Germans lost less than the French and British combined. That's kind of the most important part, I guess. On the ground, the Allies suffered somewhere around 325,000 total casualties, not including prisoners of war. But the numbers again here are very flimsy. Like, you can find numbers ranging from 50,000 either side of 325,000, or you can find, 325,000 for the French by themselves, not counting the British or the Belgians or the Dutch or anybody else. And also, among the French forces, there were wild swings from one division to another around total casualties due to where they might have been positioned, and often where specifically they were positioned in June. For example, one French division, the 29th Alpine, would lose about 93% of its officers during the June fighting, with many of those confirmed killed or wounded. Along with the manpower losses on the Allied side, the losses in equipment were staggering. During the evacuations from Dunkirk, the French retreats and surrenders in the north, and then the long retreats in June, huge numbers of everything from infantry weapons to artillery to trucks and everything in between was captured by the Germans. This included 2.8 million tons of fuel that was captured among all the territory taken by the Germans during their invasions, and enough trucks to motorize multiple infantry divisions, trucks that would still be in use during Operation Barbarossa over a year later. Even if all the vehicles were kind of worn and would be difficult to find spare parts and replacements for, the massive equipment captured by the Germans was a tremendous boon for an army that was already having issues fully equipping its divisions. Some of the equipment, particularly French artillery captured during the campaign, would still be in use 4 years later when it was used by the Germans against Allied forces in the second invasion of France. With the end of the fighting between Germany and France also came the beginning of the occupation. The exact structure of that occupation and the events that would occur in France during the occupation are kind of beyond the scope of this episode series, although don't worry, a dedicated series on the life of those in occupied Europe is already in the works. But at a high level, there were 4 major considerations when it came to life in occupied France: the separation between the occupied and Vichy zones, occupation payments, prisoners of war, and the economy. The new French government would have to deal with the separation between the occupied areas of northern France and then the more independent areas of southern France that were under the direct control of the Vichy leaders, and, I guess, directly under the command of Pétain. This also, of course, involved the relationship between the Vichy government and Germany, which was a relationship that would shift and change drastically over the years of occupation, both in terms of expectations and reality. At least initially, the Vichy leaders hoped that there would be good relations with Germany, especially if they proved that they could work with the German government through collaboration, sort of with their various requests and demands. The long-term goal was to take control of the occupied territories back from the Germans through some kind of treaty or agreement, and also to end the payment of occupation payments. These payments would begin almost immediately after the armistice was signed and would amount to around 400 million francs per day, which covered all of the money required by the occupied forces in northern France, plus a considerable amount of other items. The exact number of occupation payments would change over the years, decreasing in 1941 before ramping up in the years that followed. These changes had little to do with German feelings, or I guess the Germans feeling bad, that they were essentially impoverishing all of France. They didn't have much of a problem with that, but instead based on concerns that they were extracting too much money and that was hampering the French economy. Germany's goal in France, unlike maybe in Eastern Europe, was that France's economy could be incorporated into the German war machine, with raw materials and finished goods all exported to Germany to fuel the Wehrmacht. But with the businesses and the factories and everything else still owned by the French. This meant that they needed the French companies and the existing French economic sort of infrastructure and organization to be retained, because they wanted to lessen the load on the German political apparatus. This would cause a decrease in occupation payments due to the growing belief that they were sort of so high that the French economy could not function well enough to be exploited by the Germans, which is kind of a weird thing to think about. The final topic here is the French prisoners of war. They also kind of played into this sort of economic area as well, because around 1.8 million Frenchmen had been taken prisoner during the campaign, mostly towards the end. Some of these prisoners, or a very few of them, were released back to France, especially those that played important and hard-to-replace roles within French industry, but the vast majority of the prisoners would remain in Germany for the rest of the war. The Vichy leaders hoped to eventually change all this and to bring France into a position of independence within a German-controlled Europe, a position that they would never achieve, and never really had a chance to achieve, due to the continued resistance of Britain. Germany placed a lot of emphasis on the signing of an official peace treaty to end the war at some point in the future, instead of just the armistice of June 1940, which was seen as temporary. Unfortunately for the French, these negotiations could only happen, and sort of many of the sanctions and controls over France could only finally end when Germany was no longer at war with Britain, France's ally. The fact that Great Britain continued to fight meant that Germany refused to begin any kind of negotiations to officially end the sort of state of conflict it was in with France, and so France would continue to be occupied. And it would continue to be occupied until sort of late in 1944. Before we leave this Fall of France series behind, we're going to have one more episode. It kind of functions as an epilogue in some ways, where we are going to discuss the Riom trials of 1942. Now, obviously, this jumps us ahead in the timeline a little bit, but the Riom trials are really interesting because it involves the Vichy government, set up by Pétain, sort of controlling southern France. It puts them and the pre-war French governments of Daladier and Léon Blum sort of in a verbal fighting match, I guess, at a Riom trial, which ended up being just an absolutely incredible cell-phone by the Vichy government. Like, just a colossal mistake. And I look forward to talking to you about that next episode.